Very good morning to you, and you're welcome to the last Signpost webinar for 2020. I hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Mark Gibson, and I'm the manager of the Teagasc Connected programme. This series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network, and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. And I'm delighted to announce that a new season of the Signpost webinar series will commence on Friday, the 8th of January. So we do hope you can join us in the new year for the new series. So I would like to say that also that, as you know, agriculture in Ireland is highly influenced by national and EU policy. The Common Agricultural Policy, also known as the CAP, contains ambitious targets for the sector, while incorporating the Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategies. The current round of CAP expires at the end of this year, and the EU Parliament has just agreed to implement an extension of the current CAP until the end of 2022. So what are the policy challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for Irish farming? I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Alan Matthews from Trinity College Dublin, who is a world expert in EU agricultural policy. Alan, you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost series.
Good morning, Mark, and good morning to everybody.
Alan, you're joining us from Denmark this morning. How's everything up there today?
Well, unfortunately, like you at home, the government has reintroduced restrictions again from today, so it's not going to be the same Christmas here as would be normal, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think we're all experiencing that across the country, and look, it'll be a historic Christmas, I think, when we look back at it in years to come. Alan, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you do? You obviously have a well-read blog that you publish very regularly on EU policy, but maybe you could tell us about the work that you do.
Well, I suppose my focus has been on European agricultural policy. I'm now retired from Trinity, so I have a little bit more flexibility in terms of my interests, but I do try to follow developments at European level. I've also had an interest in agricultural trade policy issues. They're less prominent today than they were maybe 10 years ago when WTO and World Trade Organization was you know, a household word almost in Irish homes. But so it's been a really exciting time for European agricultural policy, because the scope of the area has dramatically widened in a very short period of time. So clearly there are still the important treaty objectives of food security, of viable farm incomes, but we're now increasingly aware of the environmental footprint of agricultural production, the climate impact, and these are some of the new challenges that we have to grapple with.
Indeed. So there's lots of exciting times ahead on an EU level, but of course we have Brexit on our doorstep. Who would have believed that we are where we are now today? And I mean, Alan, what's your overall view on how the impacts of this for Irish agriculture?
Well, it's not a good story, is it? And all we can try to do is to minimize the damage. And clearly, a free trade agreement is the most important objective at this point in time. It won't prevent some of the additional trading costs that will inevitably come, but it will certainly help to minimize them. And if we don't have a free trade agreement at the end of the year, then we really do face a very difficult 2021. I did see where the government has, or at least seems to be talking about a support package for agriculture, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think it will be important to take on board that this is not like a temporary cyclical drop in the market that we can expect to recover after a year or two. This will be a fundamental structural change in terms of the loss of our most, or at least the diminution of the attractiveness of our most important market for agricultural goods. So how to adjust to that has got to be a sort of a key concern in terms of how that support package is used.
Okay, well, look, I'm going to ask you now, Alan, if you could share your screen with us for your presentation. And just while you're doing that, I'll just remind everybody that you can ask questions to Alan or to ourselves using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We do welcome as much interaction from you, the audience. And Alan, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks again, Mark. I'm just clearing some of the things from the screen here. So what I'd like to discuss with you is some of the changes that are coming from Brussels. So not the Brexit issue that we've just mentioned, and these, of course, are both the negotiations around the future CAP itself, but also taking on board some of the challenges that have been highlighted in the European Green Deal, and in particular the farm to fork and biodiversity strategies. So in terms of what I'd like to do in the next half hour, I think we need to recognize at the outset that Irish agriculture is not on a sustainable path at this point in time. We know that greenhouse gas emissions, yes, they have fallen last year, but the trend has been upwards, and they're still higher than they were in 1990. We know that we exceed our legal limits on ammonia. We saw the EPA water quality indicator report last week suggesting that the water quality is also disimproving. And we know that from the reviews of the National Biodiversity Action Plan that also biodiversity is still not recovering. So we do have challenges, and the question is, what do we need to do to address these challenges? And I suppose everyone listening is going to have their own list of things which are important. But I think on any list, we need to identify innovation to lower the environmental footprint of production. And to improve the profitability of sustainable alternatives. We need an appropriate regulatory baseline, no doubt about that. But we also need to reward and support farmers who adopt more sustainable practices. So the question of using the CAP payments to farmers in a more targeted way is something which I think we'll come back to in the course of the presentation. And of course, for many, the challenges will appear as threats. And of course, we want to try to minimize those threats as much as possible. But of course, in any change situation, there are also business opportunities. And I think it's important to keep a focus on, what these opportunities might be in the emerging bioeconomy, in terms of renewable energies, in terms of carbon farming, and I'm sure there are other ideas out there. So what I want to try to focus on is what might be the opportunities in the new CAP to support this necessary transition, and how can Ireland best use the opportunities. And as will become clear, we still don't have a final framework, and I'll spend a lot of time outlining the different proposals that are on the table, particularly in the ongoing trialogues around the CAP. So just a sort of a quick look back at the last 2 or 3 years, which really have been a roller coaster in terms of agricultural policy making. We had the Commission's proposal for the new CAP, so-called CAP post-2020 in June of 2018. This promised this new delivery model, greater responsibility for member states to set their own targets, their own strategies, but underlying this a higher level of environmental and climate ambition. Of course, implementing this depends on money. So there was a huge focus on the negotiations around the medium-term EU budget, what we call this multi-annual financial framework. That got stuck for a long time between the so-called frugal member states who wanted a very tight ceiling on the overall EU budget, and those that would emphasize the need to address not just the gap left by the UK's departure, which obviously left a big hole in the EU budget, but also the many new priorities that the EU needs to face. We saw eventually in June of this year an agreement. Of course, that took place in the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So it was accompanied by a really remarkable breakthrough in terms of this additional funding from what's called the Next Generation EU recovery instrument, an extra 750 billion euro, which will be raised through, for the first time, through borrowing on financial markets. Just a word of warning that although eventually just a week ago, the European Council finally signed off on that medium-term EU budget, the resources to finance it still have to be approved individually by all national parliaments. So that process still must be gone through before we can be absolutely sure the money is in place. We then had a new commission which took office at the beginning of December of last year, and its flagship proposal was this European Green Deal. And the three, there's many elements to it, but the three that I think are most important for agriculture are the climate law, because that will set in legislation the target that Europe will become the first net zero continent by 2050, and will also significantly raise the level of its mitigation ambition in 2030 as compared to the current plan. Because of the delays in both the budget negotiations and as a result of that in the CAP reform negotiations, it was clear that a transitional arrangement was necessary to cover the period between the ending of the current CAP, the end of this year, and the coming into force of the new CAP. The Commission originally hoped that that transition period would be a single year, but it turned out that 2 years is necessary. So we have a transitional regulation, which, as Mark just mentioned, was approved by the Parliament last Tuesday. So we now know what to expect for the next 2 years. And then the new CAP will come into force at the beginning of 2023. Let me just focus on the outcome of those budget negotiations from an Irish perspective. And my assessment is that they are quite positive. So what I've done in this slide is to compare for the two pillars of the CAP, the direct payments and the rural development programs, the total amount of EU funding coming in the current programming period 2014-2020 and in the next period 2021 to 27. So as you can see, a very small reduction in the direct payments envelope, but that actually is more than compensated by an increase in the rural development, the Pillar 2 contribution. Part of that is because of an additional 8 billion that was added at European level to the Pillar 2 funding from this recovery instrument that I mentioned earlier. And you can see that for Ireland, that amounts to an additional 190 million over the next 2 years. Of course, for rural development, that is co-financed between the EU and member states. So there is a national contribution, which in Ireland was almost as big as the EU contribution in the previous period. We don't, of course, as yet have an indication of what that national contribution might be in the coming period. So I've simply put a question mark here, and it will depend on outstanding issues to be resolved in terms of the overall percentage share of the EU contribution in the future. If we just look at the figures for the coming year, so those were for the last slide was for the overall 7-year period. Again, you'll see a very small decrease in the direct payment envelope. And actually, what's maybe not often realized is that the financial year 2021 actually pays for the payments that farmers are getting in this current calendar year. This is what we call the claim year. I just saw on the department's payments website up to the 11th of December that so far they've actually paid out almost the full amount. But I highlight in particular this really dramatic increase in the funding available next year for rural development, partly because of the additional funding, 56 million, coming from the Next Generation EU. So I think the budget situation is certainly much more positive than we might have thought at the outset of that negotiating process. How do we use that funding? Well, as I say, for the next 2 years, we now have certainty because the CAP transitional regulation has been agreed by the Parliament. It will be formally approved by the Council in the coming days. So we know where we stand for 2021 and 2022. And the principle basically is old rules, new money. That is to say, the schemes, the conditions attached to payments and so on that farmers have been used to over the last number of years will simply continue into for the coming 2 years. There will be the possibility to reopen some of the rural development schemes. We've seen the government already making announcements to that effect, but essentially the rules will not change. There is, of course, some special conditions around the use of that next generation money, the 56 million next year. I set out the rules here, but what I would say is that for Ireland, they are not restricted. They are not constraining. They don't really reduce what we would want to use that money for in any case. So let's now turn to the big issue, which is the shape of the future CAP. We know what Phil Hogan, as the former Agricultural Commission, proposed in 2018, this new delivery model and also a new green architecture. The new delivery model is focused on a sort of performance-based approach rather than the traditional compliance-based approach to governing the CAP. So the regulation sets out 3 general objectives and then 9 specific objectives. So 3 of them around farm incomes, farm viability, 3 of them around the environment and climate, and 3 of them around rural development and more general social issues, including animal welfare. So the idea is that member states will design their CAP interventions. They will do this needs assessment, which is currently underway in the department, to identify, which should be the main priority. So there's 9 objectives, but not every objective is going to be equally important in every member state. So based on your SWOT analysis, your needs assessment, we have the possibility to identify what are the key issues, the key priorities for Ireland, and then we can design our CAP interventions to try to reach those objectives most effectively. The Commission then will monitor the progress that we are making based on the indicators and milestones that we set out in the plan. So that process of strategic planning is currently beginning in the department. Of course, since the Hogan proposal in 2018, we have since had the European Green Deal communication from the Commission, and also the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategies. And I suppose the first thing to say is that there's definitely a change in urgency, in tone, when you read these documents, compared even to what the Commission was saying prior to 2018. Yes, the Hogan proposal did try to seek higher environmental and climate ambition, but the rhetoric has certainly stepped up. And of course, that's in response to disturbing scientific evidence about the state of the environment, but also increasing pressure from citizens and from consumers. The three main documents, as I say, that are most important for agriculture are the climate law, the farm to fork, the biodiversity. I haven't put up the specific targets that are set out in these documents because I think they're by now fairly well known. What is important to notice is that the Commission has promised to make recommendations to member states. Indeed, these may well come before Christmas, but certainly shortly after. Recommendations as to what these Green Deal targets should mean when we draw up our CAP strategic plan. So in a sense, it will be the Commission's best judgment about where Ireland should be putting its CAP money, should be making its priorities in the light of what the Green Deal is trying to achieve. Now, the Commission has said that it will take the response of member states into account. In other words, how well do member states actually incorporate the Commission's advice into their strategic plans? The Commission has said it will take that response into account in the approval process, although the agricultural ministers in council have pushed back against that, saying that, look, when it comes to approval, you've got to base yourselves on what the legislation is, and not on targets that have not yet had any sort of formal approval through the co-legislator. And there has been this debate about should there be an impact assessment to look at the consequences of these targets. From what I can understand, the Commission is certainly there is work going on in the Joint Research Centre of the Commission. When that will be published is an open question. But of course, if any of those targets were to become legal targets, there would, of course, be an obligation for an impact assessment. So we wait to see what the Commission is going to bring out in the new year on that. So that's by way of background. Now let's focus in on the green architecture, and this is the current green architecture, familiar to all of you listening in. For Pillar 1, we have a basic payment, we have a greening payment, and for all CAP payments, there is this baseline of cross-compliance. So these are both statutory requirements, but also the so-called GAIAC standards, good agricultural and environmental condition standards that farmers must observe in order to be eligible for the full payment. And then in Pillar 2, we have in rural development programs, we have agri-environment climate schemes, which are again very familiar to Irish farmers. So that's the current green architecture. What the Commission has proposed is that the greening payment will disappear, but the greening requirements, the requirements that farmers had to observe to be eligible for those payments, will be incorporated along with cross-compliance into what they are calling enhanced conditionality. So this is going to combine the existing cross-compliance with some revisions, as we'll see in a moment, with the greening element. And then a portion of the direct payments envelope will be allocated to this new eco schemes, which are also designed to reward farmers for going beyond the baseline in terms of agri-environment and climate practices. And then in the rural development programs, again, we have the voluntary agri-environment schemes as well. So what I want to do is to indicate to you where there is still uncertainty, because both the Council and the Parliament have agreed their negotiating position on the CAP, but we don't have yet a final outcome. So they are engaged in what we call the trialogue process, which is this bilateral negotiations, but the Commission also being present, and it's likely to take at least until the spring before we have an outcome. So I wanted just to share with you the differences between what the Commission originally proposed, so that's on the left-hand side of the screen, and what the Council and the Parliament have, what amendments they are suggesting. What I've highlighted in green are the former greening requirements. So for example, GAIAC 1 would become maintenance of permanent grassland that existed, but it was a greening requirement. It would now be part of this enhanced conditionality. And the Council and Parliament position is to add a 5% flexibility to that. A new GAIAC will be appropriate protection of wetland and peatlands, potentially very important in Ireland. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Council proposing a somewhat different wording: minimum protection of wetland and peatland by 2025. So some delay in introducing that particular standard. Whereas the Parliament talks about effective protection rather than appropriate protection of wetlands. I'm not sure, I can't personally see whether these imply greater ambition or some relaxation of the Commission proposal, you know, the difference between appropriate and effective and minimum, but no doubt those who are closely associated with these negotiations fight over these words quite intensively. Buffer strips along watercourses is of course an existing GAIAC. The Parliament would specify that these should be of minimum width of 3 meters. The Commission proposed a new GAIAC requiring farmers to engage in nutrient management planning. Some Irish farmers do that as part of GLAS or as part of their nitrates directive obligations, but this would become mandatory for all farmers under the Commission proposal. But both the Parliament and Council don't believe this should be part of conditionality. They would delete this. For tillage farmers, there's a GAIAC no bare soil in the most sensitive periods. Again, some changes in wording which potentially could maybe relax or weaken that requirement a little bit. The more controversial ones are on this page. So the Commission is proposing as a GAIAC standard crop rotation. In other words, arable farmers would be required as a condition of getting their basic payment to engage in a minimum amount of crop rotation. Both the Council and Parliament wish to weaken this, exempting small farms, although the Parliament would say that you actually have to have a leguminous crop in that rotation in order to be eligible. GAIAC 9 is the old ecological focus areas. So the Commission proposed a minimum share devoted to non-productive features and the retention of landscape, non-productive areas and the retention of landscape features. This has been, the amendments would considerably water this down. So for Ireland, that would mean extending a minimum share of non-productive areas from arable farms, which is what the ecological focus areas refer to all farms. So it would include our grassland farms as well. Both the Parliament and the Council wish to basically retain the existing ecological focus area principle, confining it to arable farms and keeping a lot of the exemptions, for example, the possibility to plant nitrogen fixing crops, so it's not completely non-productive land and so on. So that's, I think, an area where the Commission is going to try to push back and see to what extent they can hold on to their original proposal. And then for those farmers who are in Natura 2000 sites, the Commission, a very simple but perhaps far-reaching proposal, a ban on converting permanent grassland. The Council and the Parliament suggesting some weakening of that in various directions. The other major change in the green architecture, as we've seen, are these eco-schemes. Eco-schemes supposed to be mandatory for member states to introduce, but voluntary for farmers to participate. And here, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what these schemes will look like in the final regulation. First of all, what should be their scope? It's clear the Commission envisages eco-schemes as designed to pay farmers for practices which address agri-environment and climate issues. So the specific objectives D, E, and F in the regulation. The Council and Parliament want to widen that scope to include animal welfare, which both parties agree, but also other types of actions that would improve competitiveness, farm competitiveness in the case of the Parliament, or general economic and social development in rural areas in the case of the Council. So really that would very greatly extend the scope of eco-schemes from what the Commission had proposed. So we'll have to wait to see whether those changes actually come about in practice. A second important amendment is that the Commission, funnily enough, didn't propose any minimum spending on eco-schemes. They were to be mandatory for member states, but there was no minimum figure. The Council is proposing a 20% minimum. The Parliament is proposing a 30% minimum. And of course, the concern of agricultural ministries and our own ministry also is if these schemes are voluntary, and if they're not taken up by farmers, what happens to the money that might be otherwise left and distributed? So that's an issue which remains to be resolved. And then finally, there is the question of how the payment rates are set in eco-schemes. So eco-schemes can fund virtually the same types of practices as we are familiar with in the agri-environment climate schemes in Pillar 2. But the funding rates can be different, whereas under Pillar 2 schemes, your funding has to be linked to the costs incurred or the income forgone. Eco schemes would be potentially more flexible. They could be simply a top-up to the farmer's basic payment. And again, it remains to be seen how that would work out in practice. I want to just highlight, because I know it has been a real concern in Ireland, this definition of eligible hectares. and the fact that farmers often feel they must clear land because otherwise it might not be eligible for payment. And I think there's good news on this front. Both the Council and Parliament are making proposals which would considerably relax that constraint and would allow land which, potentially is valuable as biodiversity habitat to be included as eligible land and thus be eligible for payment. There's a debate about whether the 30% limit in Pillar 2 should remain or be increased to 35%. And there's also a debate about how large the EU contribution to rural development programs will be in the future. But my final slide really is just to try to bring this together and ask, what are the implications for Ireland of these changes? And I would suggest, first of all, it's around the level of ambition that we want to set for ourselves when we design our CAP strategic plan. And it's going to be interesting to see what the Commission proposes when it makes these guidelines to us, or sends these guidelines to us in terms of its Green Deal recommendations. As I say, the GAIAC standards remain to be finally resolved, but even when they are, they then have to be translated into specific farm obligations in an Irish context. So that's going to be an important focus as well, because they represent the baseline that farmers have to meet before they become eligible for the voluntary payments in either eco schemes or agri-environment climate schemes in Pillar 2. There's the question of how we design eco schemes. And as I say, we still don't really know what the scope of these schemes is going to be. The Commission has made proposals, what they think eco schemes could best be used for. They include agroforestry, agroecology, for example, more ambitious crop diversification. They include paying for organic farming. They include paying for carbon farming. The problem I see is that all of these are essentially multi-annual things. A farmer is not going to start a project to sequester carbon, for example, by re-wetting some drained organic land, if there is a risk that next year he or she isn't going to get that payment. So the annual nature of these ecosystem payments puts a constraint on what they could be best used for. And that is also, I think, an issue. We'd like to see more result-based schemes, but result-based schemes by definition will have variable outcomes and therefore variable payments. And how do we reconcile that with the annual nature of payments in Pillar 1? I think we need to think about raising the ambition of our agri-environment schemes. GLAS is popular, but it hasn't received top marks in the recent evaluations. Yes, there have been improvements in habitats and in biodiversity, but on water, on ammonia, on climate, it's very difficult to show that farms that are participating in GLAS are doing any better than farms that are not. So we need to try to rethink and to get more out of the money we spend in that area. And finally, no matter what happens, there's clearly going to be a need for a huge effort in terms of knowledge transfer, innovation, advice, and so on. These will be new schemes. There will be new demands on farmers. They will need a lot of assistance. And people like Pat and Mark will, of course, be the best to tell us what is needed in that front. So thank you for listening. And hopefully I've left some time for questions. So Mark, I hand back to you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for excellent overview of where things are at, and I really enjoy your unique perspective on these things. Alan, just to kick off the discussion, we heard a lot of mention about simplification during Phil Hogan's time as commissioner. Have you seen evidence of this simplification happening? I mean, you've been looking at various iterations of CAP over the years. Are we getting any closer to a more simplified CAP?
Well, I have to say that if you look back at the series of CAP reforms we've had since McSherry in 1992, every commissioner has said that simplification is one of his or her objectives. We had Marianne Fisher-Bull as well. Uh, it's clear to me that as we ask farmers to do more for the environment, schemes get more complicated. I think that that's unavoidable. Where the simplification can come in, I think, is in terms of the monitoring, the controls, the inspections, which I know a lot of farmers find intrusive and time consuming, and where potentially more clever use of digital technologies, remote sensing, satellite imaging, and so on could hopefully remove a lot of that aggravation, if you like, from the administration, both from the department's point of view, but also from the farmer's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, to get to that stage, we have a lot of key issues to resolve around data protection, who owns the data, if farmers are sharing data, can they be guaranteed that they still have control over their own data? So, there are issues there, but potentially that's how I would see simplification as coming, not in terms of the rules around the schemes themselves, because as I say, when you're getting into the nitty gritty of addressing these sustainability challenges, I'm afraid it is more complex. We can't escape that.
We're also joined this morning by Pat Murphy, who's head of the Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme. Pat, good morning to you.
Hi, busy looking at questions here.
Sorry, Pat, I didn't get to introduce you at the outset. Pat, there's a lot of questions coming in there, thick and fast. I think we should probably go straight to those questions. If you could maybe kick us off on those.
Yeah, there's, I suppose, a quick one. In relation to GIG, you talked about the removal of GIG 5, the mandatory NMP. Have you any idea of the rationale behind that at Commission and Council level?
I think the Council and Parliament are not necessarily against the idea that farmers should be encouraged to do nutrient planning. I think they see this as something that could become an action that might be paid for under an eco scheme or under a Pillar 2 Agri-Environment scheme, rather than something that would be included in the mandatory baseline. I think that's the issue. It's not in opposition to the nutrient planning as such, but rather where it appears in the green architecture.
Okay. Could Alan comment on whether Ireland should move more significant resources into the implementation of CAP towards results-based schemes or traditional decoupled direct income supports, and what, I suppose, flexibility is there to do that? I know you mentioned it a minute ago about targeted schemes and the challenge there, but I suppose, what's your view on the level of ambition that should be there?
Results-based schemes will not work for every type of action that we want farmers to take, but where they can work, and we have very good evidence in the pilot schemes in Ireland on this, then I think we certainly should encourage their rollout. Not only do they seem to be more effective in terms of achieving their environmental objectives, but the evidence suggests that they also get much greater farmer buy-in, because farmers can, in a sense, see the results of their actions and get paid for the results of their actions. As I've said, there may be a problem in integrating results-based schemes into the eco schemes in Pillar 1 because of the inherent maybe variability that there are in results-based schemes, which may create a problem for the department if they find come October that they haven't got enough take-up and they're left with some of their Pillar 1 envelope. So it's important clearly that we don't lose that funding, but it's also important that the funding be used as it was intended to be used for environmental purposes. So I don't think we should simply redistribute it as a sort of a basic income support. But one of the proposals, I can't remember whether it was from the Council or Parliament, suggested that any residual funding could be simply transferred to agri-environment measures in Pillar 2. And the big advantage of Pillar 2 is that it's multi-annual. So you don't lose the money in the year, even if you don't spend it. So yes, results-based schemes, I think, should be encouraged where they are obviously appropriate. I still have some question marks as to how well we could do that in the eco scheme, but certainly in the Pillar 2 scheme, in the glass type schemes. Yeah.
Okay, a question or a couple of questions in relation to the, I suppose for Ireland in particular, the balance between animal and tillage enterprises, and is there likely to be any incentive one way or the other to move production?
I wonder how what the motivation there was. I mean, clearly, you can see that some of the conditionality standards are more relevant to arable farmers, so you could say that they are more affected by those standards. But I'm not sure that that's really going to be a key factor. The Guide 1, of course, requires us to maintain permanent pasture, permanent grassland. The rationale for that is that grassland is a carbon store. If you plow that land, that carbon is released into the atmosphere. I mean, there is, to the extent that we see consumer demand shifting towards more plant-based diets, if to the extent that that is happening, and if Irish farmers want to be able to participate in that, saying that you cannot plow up your grassland may actually be inconsistent with that trend. So that's clearly something that would need to be thought about a little bit more. But just off the top of my head, I can't see anything directly in what's coming down the tracks that will influence that balance between arable and livestock.
And there's very ambitious targets for organic farming set out in the farm to fork strategy. How do you see that manifesting itself within CAP? Because in Ireland, for example, we've still a very low base in terms of overall organic farming. Do you see any bolstering of measures there to support organic farming?
I mean, ultimately, that's going to be exactly what our CAP strategic plan will decide. So basically, there's no barrier, there's no obstacle to using CAP funds to support farmers in transition and to support ongoing organic farmers. My understanding has been that there have been more farmers in Ireland who have wanted to convert to organic than there was funding to support them. The scheme was closed for a number of years. I'm not sure exactly whether it's open again at this point in time. So it will depend, I think, on what kind of target we set for ourselves. Clearly, we are starting from a much lower base, so it may not make sense to think of 25% of land by 2030, but we certainly should be increasing, and that will presumably depend then on the relative priority that we give to it in the CAP strategic plan. But no obstacle in the legislation to doing that. Yeah.
So it's
a general question there, Alan. Can farmers expect a significant increase in the demands that are being made on them to retain payments and get payments within the agri-environmental schemes?
That's a very good question, because it relates to the need to have coherence between the three, I'll call them three levels, but they may not be
I suppose another related question, and I suppose when you talk in terms of eco schemes and non-productive areas, do you see that the requirement for farmers who may have significant levels of non-productive areas, do you see them that meeting the requirements for eco scheme payment, or are all farmers going to be asked for additional efforts?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer, because there's a trade-off here between, if you like, efficiency and equity or fairness. So the efficiency argument says that, look, if you want to get the maximum environmental benefit from your eco scheme payment, then you should only pay for additionality. If you're simply paying for what's there already, then you're not actually improving what's on the ground. But then the farmer who has that non-productive area will maybe rightly feel, look, I've planned this, or it's part of my farm anyway. Why should I be penalized? Why should I not get recognition for the fact that I'm contributing these services in terms of biodiversity or flood protection or whatever? So I think there will inevitably be some payment made to recognize farmers who already have considerable amounts of non-productive areas on their land. It may be, and maybe this is the way around this, it might be desirable to link this to some management criteria. So it's not just that you have you leave a bit of your field, go to rack and ruin. I mean, it may well be that with your advisor, you actually can identify specific management practices which would really add value to that in terms of the biodiversity or the water quality or the carbon sequestration or whatever. So that could be a way of combining recognizing what farmers are doing already with actually getting some improvement and additional environmental benefit.
Okay, there's a couple of comments then as well. One kind of making the point that it's important that we get the message out to farmers that there is likely change in relation to some of the non-eligible areas potentially on the way, to make sure that we don't lose them in the last in the last period before they're made eligible. A couple of comments, just I suppose to assure people, there was a couple of questions about the presentation. I think a couple of people didn't see it or couldn't see it very well for whatever reason. That it will be made available on the website. We usually have it up, I think, by Monday. So if that's okay with Alan, that will be made available. Mark?
Alan, there's a few questions coming in here in relation to active farmer, that term that has been, used through various iterations of the CAP. Are we any closer to having a definition of that, or should I say, sort of implementation of that definition within the CAP policy?
I didn't refer to this in the presentation because it's I suppose not directly part of the sort of the green architecture that I was focusing on. It's still highly contested. The Commission tried to put forward a proposal calling it sort of genuine farmers rather than active farmers now. But there's been pushback, and the Council's position is again that any rules around this should be voluntary, should not be set out in the legislation, and should be left up to member states. So I see this as most likely ending up as something we decide as part of our CAP strategic plan. So to the extent that there are issues in Ireland that need to be addressed, we may have that possibility to do so because we will set the definition of who is eligible for the payments in the CAP strategic plan.
We had a Patrick Barrett a number of weeks ago from the Department of Agriculture speaking about the bioeconomy, and it was very interesting afterwards. There was a huge amount of positivity, and it led to a lot of optimism amongst many of the people I spoke to after the presentation, because they felt actually this is presenting a new vision for agriculture. Do you see opportunities there for the bioeconomy or measures within CAP to support the ambitions of the circular bioeconomy?
I certainly wouldn't be as au fait with the potential as Patrick would be, but I think the general point is hugely important that you just make, and I sort of said it at the outset, but it's a good opportunity to reiterate it. That yes, the challenges that farmers are facing in terms of the Green Deal, the challenge in terms of reducing emissions, of reducing pollution to waterways, of stopping the decline in biodiversity, getting our ammonia down, and so on. They can seem overpowering, and they can seem as simply as threats. And therefore, I do think we need to recognize that, yes, it is a period of change. I don't think farmers have ever not had a period of change, but it's perhaps coming more rapidly than we're used to. But change always brings opportunities, and we do need to spend time and also devote some of the CAP resources to actually supporting the next generation of farm activities. They may be somewhat different to what we're used to. We will have to move away from some of the traditional practices, and we do need to make sure that those new opportunities are reflected in the supports that are provided in the upcoming plan.
Alan, a question there, an interesting one, might be a whole debate in itself in relation to the increased standard effectively being brought about by the Green Deal, and the impact of that on potential trade with other blocks that may not be bringing in the same levels of standards, and the distortion that might bring. As I say, it could be a whole day in itself to discuss, but any quick comment on what might arising from that?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly part of the debate. Indeed, we see it in the more general sense in the trade agreement, the trade negotiations, I should say, with the with the UK at the moment, where level playing field issues have been one of the last remaining knotty issues, to prevent too great a divergence in standards, and that's exactly I think the thought behind this question. I answer it in two ways, Pat. One is that to the extent that what we are asking farmers to do in the Green Deal is, in a sense, agricultural intensification is certainly not the only driver of some of the sustainability challenges that I have referred to, but it is an important one, and the EPA has made that clear. So where agriculture is responsible for these, if you like, what economists use the term negative externalities, but these poor environmental outcomes, if you like, then I don't, I think for the credibility of our image as a sustainable food producing nature, we have to address those issues regardless of what other countries are doing. It's in our own interest to do so if we want to maintain our image of the green island. So the argument that we should wait until everybody is on board, just doesn't stand up. But having said that, there are areas where once we do raise our standards, we certainly would like to see other countries follow. And for example, with respect to the use of antimicrobials, which is a serious threat to human health and something we can't really wait on. Not such a dramatic issue in Ireland as it would be in other countries where you have larger confined animals systems. But the EU is saying in its new veterinary regulation, look, unless you actually show that you are making progress, we will simply not allow your products onto our market, specifically on antimicrobial use or antibiotic use. So I think there may be one or two areas where we can address issues of level playing field in a targeted way. But I would be, as I say, in principle, for a lot of these issues, we need to do this for our own reputation and for the reputation of our produce in consumer eyes. Yeah.
Alan, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're actually a little bit over time, but really enjoyed your presentation. Very, very insightful, and it's always good to get an overview and to kind of step back from these things, I think, and to see what direction we're headed. So thank you for the time and effort you put into today's presentation, and want to wish you happy Christmas, and hope things settle down in Denmark on the COVID side of things. So
thanks very much for inviting me, and hopefully people got something out of it, and happy to, there's an email there somewhere if anybody wants to get in touch and disagree or agree, hopefully, with anything that I might have said. So thanks, Mark, and thanks, Pat.
Okay, thanks again. So just to wrap things up, 2020 we know has been an extraordinary and testing year for everyone. We started the Signpost series last April, and almost 40 weeks later and 1,700 participants later, we have covered a broad range of topics related to farm sustainability. I want to say a special thank you to all of our panelists who contributed to the series throughout the year. And in particular, I want to thank our production team, Andy Boland, Pat Murphy, Yvonne Maher, Noel Meehan and Catherine Keena, who have worked hard to put together, I think you'll agree, a stimulating schedule throughout the year. And finally, I want to thank you, the viewers, for all of your insightful questions and contributions throughout the year. And it just leaves for me to wish you and your families a happy and safe Christmas. And I hope you can join us again on the 8th of January for the start of our new season. So with that, we say goodbye, and we wish you well and hope to see you again in the new year. Thanks again. Bye-bye.